Hello, welcome to another episode of The Joy of the Rediscovered album. So this week we're taking a look at the period around when Gold Against the Soul was released. So this came out in June 1993, so I'm going to be rambling on about my life around about 1993, the sort of things musically that I was listening to, a little bit about my career at that time, and a few other references to British cinema and UK TV as well, thrown in for good measure. So yeah, 1993 was an interesting year. In the previous episode I'd mentioned that 87, which was the year when In Excess Kick was released, was quite a challenging year for me. Well, 1993 I always see as the year of the big reboot. So from 81 through to 93, I'd been, I suppose the expression is like climbing the slippery pole. So I had a career in vitro diagnostics, and in 81, when I left school, I started out as a junior lab technician, and over the course of numerous job changes, job title changes, departmental changes, ended up as quality control manager. But by about 1993 I was becoming a bit disillusioned with the whole thing, and I'm sure this resonates with many people, but often you get to a point in a career, and it's funny, my dad always jokes about this, if ever I'm in a position more than about 10 years, he always says, oh, isn't it about time you normally make a move at this point? And I do find that after, getting up to 10 years working somewhere, I often find that it's time to reboot some aspect of something. But often that choice or that inclination is forced because I find myself in a position where I'm in a sort of groundhog day where you're seemingly dealing with the same problems that you felt like you dealt with a few weeks ago or a year ago or even a couple of days ago, and despite your best efforts they seem to be coming back because of the chaos and entropy inherent in any environment. So it does feel a bit like, you're playing sort of whack-a-mole with a lot of stuff. And I suppose I'd entered that point in my career at that particular firm and was looking to move on. And the big change for me was that it was definitely a move from having IT as an adjunct to something, whereas IT became something in and of itself, and that was something that happened over probably the course of the 93 into the late 90s really. But it all started around this time in 93, where I went from having IT as a means to an end to slowly becoming it both a means to an end and an end in of itself. And so when I listened to this album like I did this week, listening back to it for the first time in a long while, it brought back memories of that big reboot, and we'll stumble across other albums no doubt which also I very much associate with that time. So I basically just resigned from my position at the time and went temping for a while, and then ended up in an accounts office, and that really started everything off. I opened up more time for me to be able to do a postgrad in parallel through the Open University, which was in computing and manufacturing, and then everything just sort of fell into line from there really. And plus the fact that where I worked at the accounts office, which was a company called Radio Rentals, was just such a great place to work. Pay wasn't great, but people were lovely, and had a great time there, and was sad to leave actually. I basically just left because eventually through doing that and doing Open University, I was able to move on to other careers in IT. So this was the start of all of that, really. And it's funny because I can remember at this period as well, like when I was driving around on the forest and hanging out on Ashdown Forest, like parking up, me having this long-term idea of working for myself doing IT troubleshooting, which I eventually did in, around 1998. So yeah, never let go of your dreams, because they do eventually come to fruition. So with this one, what we're up to, the second album, and it was great when I re-listened to this. So let's have a look. Track listing. So yeah, Sleep Flowers is definitely my favourite track. I was aware of Manic Street Preachers prior to me buying this album, but I literally bought it when it came out on the strength of hearing them do a performance of this live on some TV music show in the evening. And yeah, it's a great album if you've never checked it out. It's the second album. I think my favourite Manic Street Preachers album is not on this album. It's actually on the previous album, and it is the track which should be here, Motorcycle Emptiness. That's definitely my favourite Manic Street Preachers album. In terms of their overall back catalogue, let's have a look and see what's what in terms of that. It's not a band I necessarily kept up with, actually. The other interesting thing about them, and this brings back memories of the time, and again we'll see, is 93 was an interesting period because Manic Street Preachers predate the whole Britpop era in music, but in 1993 I think the first Suede album had been released, so this band were never really lumped in with that movement, or like as an adjunct to it. And so it was interesting listening to this band and then eventually getting into bands like Blur and Oasis and those sort of bands. But also there was a number of trip hop bands which I think I've mentioned before. And then we also had, grunge featuring fairly heavily in the UK at that point, just prior to this. And then, of course, we're at the tail end of what's called the scene that celebrates itself, which would be shoegaze. So no doubt we'll get some shoegaze albums come up. But it's funny, I completely, I was pretty much blindsided. I just didn't get into shoegaze. The only band I really got into was Lush from that period. But yeah, I think this is actually one of my favourite albums from that period. But as you'll see, there's a lot of really good albums. So let's just start by looking at them. Yeah, really, I exclusively listened to this. So bought this when it came out. And then I waited a few years and bought these two retrospectively once I started buying CDs. And I think I remember either borrowing a copy or having a copy of this, because I did listen to this. Because this has got A Design for Life on it, Kevin Carter. Yeah. Maybe a friend of mine had it and I listened to it a lot around their place, but I'm pretty familiar with this, so I just don't have a strong memory as I do with the other three albums of buying them. And if you've never checked the band out, they're well worth checking out. In terms of what album I would probably start off with, I don't know, maybe this album as a good starting point. I mean, probably the first two. I mean, this is a good album, but it's a little bit more challenging, I think. Mainly because of what Richie Edwards was going through at the time. So yeah, I have that sort of association with the album. But yeah, I mean, any album really from that early period. So I've mentioned Richie Edwards. So yeah, he went missing 95. So basically, where is it? Let's go back a stage here. Yeah, here we go. So between the Holy Bible and Everything Must Go. Yeah, just disappeared. Presumed dead. Yeah, missing for 28 years, 8 months and 16 days. And yeah, they were due to go on this promotional tour. Yeah, it has, in some ways sadly it has echoes of, Joy Division, I suppose. Circumstances are slightly different, but like on the eve of really the next level in their career, if you like. Yeah. I used to actually, this is the so he went missing around the Severn Bridge. I used to regularly travel across this, actually. It's a really interesting structure, and there's a number of really interesting YouTube videos about the construction of this bridge, and just the construction generally of bridges across the Severn, across the River Severn. But in the late 90s, I worked for a brief period of time, about 18 months. I worked for a value-added reseller doing accounts modification on big scary account system, and we had a client in Brecon Beacons down in Wales. So I regularly used to make trips down to Wales and across this bridge. It's funny, I read the other day that I didn't even realise they'd actually removed the toll on it at some point. When I used to travel down there was a toll on it. Very impressive. So we've gone on down a bit of a let's have a look. So we've got the second Severn crossing. Actually, no, it was this one. Yeah, actually, because I did know there was two, but the second Severn Bridge. So yeah, across this one, which is even more impressive. Yeah, there we go. So, but it was the other one then. Okay. Oh, this is one of the good things about these episodes. I never quite know what I'm going to find. I end up correcting myself. So yeah, so this is so this was built, when was it? Opened in 1966. Oh, that's right, because they renamed the other one, the Prince Wales Bridge, a lot later. And then they sort of renamed the motorway rename. That's what always confuses me. So yeah, this is the one I used to take down to Wales. And this was opened in 1996, right? Yeah. Well, so yeah, literally, I started doing that trip in when would it have been? Yeah, 97, 98. So yeah, it literally only just opened. Okay. Wow, I hadn't even realised that actually. But yeah, very cool structure. Okay, I've gone off at a bit of a sidetrack there. I'm supposed to be talking about music, but that did. I hadn't planned on talking about this actually when I was putting the episode together, but it just reminded me. Okay, so back on track. So on Last FM we have a list of similar bands. And I'm looking at this actually, and it's interesting because I got into Suede and Pulp and bought a couple of Ash albums. Haven't listened to much Manson or Ocean Colour Scene beyond what was on the radio, but there's this band Idlewild who I literally only just started listening to, and they're well worth checking out. And of course Elastica had their debut album, and there was a lot of Supergrass and Stereophonics on the radio as well. So yeah, that certainly is a good list of bands that were certainly around, around that time in terms of like UK indie bands actually. I think they all are, yeah. Right, so I'm going to have a look at the Crowing albums of the year. And now when I look at this, there's so many albums here that I bought at the time. So this, I'd got into Pearl Jam around the time of the first album. Chaos AD, Sepultura, got into them around the time of Arise, I think. I wasn't listening to Entombed at that point. I didn't get into them until about 98. Monster Magnet, I can't remember what album I got into them, a bit later, probably 99. Had this album in part because I think I'd mentioned in a previous episode that my youngest brother was playing the first album incessantly when it came out. Carcass Heartwork, yeah, I was aware of them but didn't I think actually the album previous to this was when I sort of started getting into their back catalogue, and I had this album when it came out as well. This is a really good album actually. This has got, John Bush as the vocalist. I really enjoyed this album actually. It used to be one of my favourite albums to listen to when I was walking on Ashdown Forest actually. The following year looks pretty impressive as well. So looking at around the time that the album was released, so what did it say? It was June, I think, of 93. Yeah, June 93. Just seeing what else was released around that time period before we dive deeper into 93. So here we go, June. You can see, although I don't know how clear it is, there's ones here where I've clearly looked at before. So in the same month we had Gravity's Rainbow. I don't even remember that album. I've got the first had the first 3 or 4 Pat Benatar albums, I think. And there's a Slow Dive album, came out the same month. What we're up to now, the 4th studio album by English pop rock band Tears for Fears. They had quite a big gap between, I think, albums 2 and 3 anyway, from what I remember. It seemed like a long period. 14 songs by Paul Westerberg. Didn't become aware of him until the film Singles. Yeah, if you singles. Now that's a great film if you really like playing Spot, the cameo role. There's all sorts of people related to the grunge music scene in there, like Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, a few others. Yeah, so there's Gold Against the Soul. Individual Thought Patterns by Death. Yeah, no, I probably bought... I don't think I bought that album. I was already into them at this point. But what was the previous album to that? I think I had Symbolic actually, but... oh, Human, that was it, yeah. I bought that when it came out. So yeah, definitely I was on a bit of a death metal jag. Oh yeah, I had this album, Covenant. Also, same month, Exile in Guyville came out by Liz Phair. I think we'll probably find there's quite a lot of female singer-songwriters in '93 as well, who had quite significant albums out. In on the Kill Taker by Fugazi, that's a great album. That came out in the same month. Yeah, I got into them a little bit later. Debut album by Bjork came out in July. It was Europa by U2. Black Sunday by Cypress Hill. I didn't get into these a lot later, but I really like sort of Cypress Hill sound actually. I like that sort of really almost like doomy hip hop. I suppose that the two styles of hip hop I tend to gravitate most to are the sort of more doomy style of someone like Cypress Hill and industrial hip hop as well. Chrome by Catherine Wheel. Yeah, there were quite a few like alternate, like UK alternative rock bands, in that period who were on like first, second albums just before Britpop became a thing and sort of during grunge. And it's interesting, and that's part of the reason why I probably didn't check out more of them, is because, grunge eclipsed a lot of stuff. Like this came out, I bought this when it came out, Siamese Dream by the Smashing Pumpkins. Yeah, so it was interesting to just see what came out around that time and what was sort of vying for my attention. The other thing is, it's interesting, so 93 I went from having quite a bit of disposable income, and I was going down to Brighton on a Sunday because the record stores was like open on a Sunday morning, even though I can't remember if Sunday morning trading was officially a thing, but there was some loophole they were exploiting. And so I used to go down on a Sunday morning and go down to Virgin and HMV, and I went from like having quite a bit of disposable income to having none towards the end of 93. So initially in 93 I was buying a lot of stuff, and then it tailed off a little bit. But bands like Typo Negative, what they were, was this second album, third, they were 3 albums in deep, but I hadn't got into them at that point. Same with Neurosis, Enemy of the Sun. I hadn't heard them mentioned until probably the mid-90s, when my team leader on on the support line I was working at that point came in and said, this flatmate was playing Neurosis really loud and driving him mad, even though he was into extreme music as well. I think it was a bit too much. Into the Labyrinth by, so they're on this, so Dead Can Dance were on their 6th album by this time period. I had this, Focus by Cynic. So I was very interested in also like technical death metal at that point, because that's the direction Death had taken. They'd gone a lot more technical. Yeah, so let's look at it in a slightly different way again. So we just look January 93 in British music. So yeah, 93, boy bands were a big thing. Whitney Houston's cover of I Will Always Love You was just dominating. Still from the previous year, I think. That. Wow, I forgot about that. It came from the album Bad Out of Hell too. That's funny. The amount of gap between the two albums. Oh yeah, Mr. Blobby. I did watch, there's some quite good reviews of the year, Top of the Pops ones from 93. They're through a weird lens. I noticed this the other day. You'll watch them and they won't always mention bands you expect them to mention, but they're well worth checking out. A lot of them on YouTube, and it's quite an interesting one from 93 that I was watching in preparation for this. Normally in prep for this, I only do two things really. I listen to a playlist, which I'll include in the links from that year, where I just collate all the albums I can find from 93 and put them in this huge Spotify playlist. And I normally have a listen to a sort of Top of the Pops review from 93, and that's about it really. I don't dig down through any of these articles until I actually come to do the episode, which is why I tend to make loads of mistakes and go off down weird rabbit holes, which is part of the appeal for me anyway. Oh, that was right, To Unlimited. So this I like looking at this because this represents sort of what was, if you just had the radio on during the day, this is the sort of stuff you would hear. So yeah, Whitney Houston, To Unlimited, Shaggy, Oh Carolina. I've mentioned Shaggy before in previous episodes. The Bluebells, Young at Heart. That was a re-release, I think. Am I right about that? Because it was used in a advert. Yeah, that's the other thing you get. Obviously, that became quite a big thing, actually, I remember, in the early to mid-90s. I mean, it still is, but that's when I became really aware of it as tracks that were used as advertising and then, doing well off the back of that. And there were all these obscure bands that you'd never heard of, like Babylon Zoo, with that track Spaceman around the 90s. And there was another one as well. Was it the band Seether, who I'd never heard of up to that point, who had a There was a lot of Levi ads that had associations and caused bands to suddenly be pushed into the limelight. This wasn't the case with the Bluebells, I don't think, Young at Heart. I think that was a completely different thing. I don't think it was Clothes, I think it was something else. Gabrielle Dreams, yeah, that was big. Live Your Mind by Freddie Mercury. So he was having like a parallel solo career at that point. Mr. Vane by Culture Beat. So there's a lot of, what would you call it, like Euro dance at that point, which I must confess to having a bit of a soft spot for. I hadn't quite started going clubbing again. That didn't happen till a bit later in the 90s. When I had a bit more money. Me and a mate used to go out on a Thursday night because it was like cheap night and boogie the night away. It was always nice. It made Fridays feel like the weekend. Album number ones, say East 17 with Walthamstow. The Cult had that compilation out. Little Angels were doing pretty well. There was a couple of bands that had almost like a history or connections, I think, back to, in one case, almost back to Nwubum. I'm trying to think of their name. There were two bands, hard rock bands, that were quite prominent in the 90s. One was Little Angels and the other one was Thunder. I think it was Thunder had links back to a tail end of new wave of British heavy metal through a band called Terraplane. So that was the other thing you might see. Like I think this year there was, I think bands like the Wild Hearts. So there was a hard rock chart resurgence just before Britpop. Yeah, there's the Suede album. Mr. Bowie was on Black Tie, White Noise by them. Automatic for the People was in the charts. Of course, some of these could be carryovers from previous years. Oh, Republic by New Order. I'll talk a little bit about that. So another place in the video, actually. And there's all the best saying. So I'll include all these links as usual if you're trying to also reacquaint yourself. And remember, of course, this is always through a UK-centric lens, because that was the period I'm living through. So I was living through at the time. So okay, album of the year. So from a metal standpoint, what do we have? I'm trying to think here, like, what did I buy when it came out? So this probably, this. It's a really interesting year because you've got a number of UK bands like Paradise Lost, My Dying Bride. I think there's an Anathema album down here somewhere. Yeah. So that's the first Anathema album. That is maybe the third or fourth Paradise Lost album. And that's the second My Dying Bride. So you've got these three bands that are commonly referred to as the Peacefield Three. All started off as doom death bands. But they were entering sort of, well, these two were entering interesting phases in their career. As Anathema had only started off, they were still heavily entrenched in a sort of doom death sound. So they were a little bit later on the curve. These, you know, I think Paradise Lost were the first one that had an album, and then My Dying Bride. But a lot of this other stuff I didn't get into until quite a bit later. So yeah, bands like Catatonia, Neurosis. There's quite a few releases here by black metal bands that I didn't really become aware of until a little bit later. I mean, I saw some of the albums in the record stores in Brighton, but I didn't really sort of clue into exactly what it was. And then bands like the Melvins, Typo Negative, Earth again. So there's a lot here that I didn't pick up. I mean, Sepultura I was still into, Carcass not till a lot later, and then bands like Quicksand as well, and Entombed. So I definitely was being distracted by something at this point, and we'll get on to what that something was, but I still had sort of a couple of toes in the metal release thing. So yeah, this is probably where I was. So yeah, I can see here loads of albums I bought when they came out. This album. This one not until a little bit later. I found that the other day actually. I got this on CD, but didn't get into PJ Harvey until around the time of Her, I think. Yeah, I had this. I remember this being really big in 93, and then 94, I think it was, 94, 95 maybe, probably 94, which I think when the next album came out, No Need to Argue, that's the one that I got onto. Where else are we? Oh, there's a Dinosaur Jr. album there. Aerosmith, Get a Grip. I'm trying to remember what that's on that album. I remember working with someone who was a big Rush fan, and they were talking about this album. There's the Manic Street Preachers album. This is quite an interesting album. There was a big hit off of this, Ordinary Day, that was kicking around the charts. You got the Belle album, Star. That's a pretty cool album. Boo Radley's. This album's really good, as is this. And you can see, so we've got Sarah McLachlan, Amy Mann, at that time, what else we got? Yeah, Sheryl Crow. I listened to that the other day, actually. That's a really good album. Yeah. Wow, just so much good stuff in 93. There's a Guided by Voices album. I didn't become aware of them until they appeared on the Buffy soundtrack for the TV series. Paul Weller was sort of... the timing was great for him. In terms of he had this album come out just as, Suede were releasing their album. So he got sort of sucked into the whole sort of Britpop, Brit rock universe as well. Having been, you could easily argue a major influence on a lot of the bands that were part of that. I remember buying this when it came out. Another band I didn't really get into at the time was Clutch. Wild Hearts. That was the other hard rock band in the UK I was trying to think of, along with Thunder, Little Angels. The band like the Wild Hearts these hard rock bands were sort of doing quite well and sort of people were aware of outside of just like hard rock fans. So moving on to more punk orientated stuff, we're going to see a bit of crossover here in terms of maybe albums we've seen already. I don't expect to see much here that I actually listened to. Yeah. And synth pop, as you know, I always like to look at this. It's funny they've roped in Republic with the synth pop. Pet Shop Boys. I had this album. I don't think I listened to this album until a lot later. But this really, I want to talk about this. I'm trying to find the other album. So a lot of big bands again that were in the rock category are going to be in alternative rock. But I wanted to include this just to see if I missed anything. Yeah, so many album covers I recognise here. It's James Lade. They were really big. St Etienne, I didn't get into until Tiger Bay, but another band, highly recommend. This is really interesting. This band, Cranes, got really unique sound, very unique female vocals. I didn't get into them until I picked up some... It was almost like a goth compilation. And one of their tracks was on that. And that's how I became aware. And that wasn't until 98. Funnily enough, there's a connection between that and working down in Wales, because I bought the compilation album at WH Smith's, which is a big newsagent chain in the UK that also used to stock albums. I don't know if they still do. And while I was down there, I was looking for something to play in the car on the way back from spending a few days down there. And I bought, there's a couple of albums I bought. There was a 12-inch singles album which had a lot of stuff like Duran Duran on it and other things. And then there was a sort of goth-inspired album which had Cranes on it. A load of other stuff as well. I remember this band being big at the time. Yeah, the chart in the UK, although I don't look at it much now, although we looked a little bit there, outside of the big hits that I looked at, was really interesting in terms of what was getting into the singles charts. As 93 was a cool year if you were into like rock music in terms of the charts, but there was loads of interesting like dance acts in there, and elements of, I suppose, trip hop and reggae, that sort of stuff. So I really enjoyed 93, not just from a reboot of my career side of things, but also just the great music that was out. And just looking at this now in overview, just album views totally, I can now see Blur bubbling up. I bought this a couple of years later, same with this. there's the Liz Phair album, Janet Jackson, Janet was out, Mariah Carey Music Box. Yeah, loads of just great. Oh, there's the Primus Pork Soda album. Yeah, and I mentioned Cypress Hill, Fugazi, Typo Negative. Again, all bands that I didn't get into a little bit later. There's Verve. So this was the album before they broke really big, I think. So this is a good chance to talk about New Order. I was hoping to also see the Jellyfish album here as well at some point. I don't know if it's going to bubble up. So I have this really lovely memory from 93. Not only did I have a major career reboot, but I just prior to that, 92, 93, through someone I used to work with when I was a quality control manager, one of my employees. There was a group of friends I met through him who were big into the local music scene. Several of them were in a local band. They also produced like a gig guide stroke fanzine at the time. I think it was called 5D. And so we had this really cool, like almost like a listening party. We just sat down. There was about, 8 of us, I think. And listened to Jellyfish and New Order. And just chatted about music. And sometimes in your life you have like one of those, hopefully you often, I do, and I hope everybody else does, but you have that situation where you have these certain times which is like, they feel like they belong on a list of the best evenings ever. And that was one. We sat down in someone's parents' conservatory with a nice hi-fi and listened to Jellyfish and the New Order album, because one of the people I knew was actually working in a record store, and of course they were all big music fans because they ran like a music fanzine and were in bands and stuff. So yeah, it was a great time just getting, and I'd never listened to this band before, and I was thinking, why hadn't I discovered this band? And if you haven't checked out this album, you need to check it out. It's a really cool album. And I think as well, if you get a decent, I ended up buying the cassette, and even that had a nice fold-out section which had a shot of the studio and had all this really nice vintage gear in it. And anybody who watches the channel will probably know I'm quite interested in like music tech, and that's one thing I wish I could do more episodes on music tech. But I tend to doubt my own expertise. I shouldn't. There's not many things actually I suffer from imposter syndrome about, funnily enough. But one thing I always have a problem with is talking about anything musical, like in terms of playing. I shouldn't, but I do. And so that's why I sort of shy off a little bit from doing more stuff about, instruments, if you like, rather than talking about music. So yeah. And then British films, what have we got? Anything I remember as being particularly sort of promoted at the time as being British cinema? I don't think I was going to the cinema that much. No, nothing really here that sticks out of being really pushed. We weren't quite into the era yet of Train Spotting, I don't think. I think that was that the following year maybe? I think that was the big film I remember from the early 90s. So no doubt in some episode, once we get to 94, 95, around the period, whenever it came out, we'll mention that, because that was massive. Did I see the? I don't think. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, there's a lot of unsures here in terms of even if I did watch that, but years later. I remember that being on as a TV series in the UK. That's what I remember about that, The Secret Garden. Oh, there we go. Yeah, there's one. The Wrong Trousers. Yes, the age of Wallace and Gromit. I got a call. I think most people from the UK probably have some Wallace and Gromit DVD or video or something. And I have quite a nice compilation with, I think, 3 of them on. Yeah. Cool. I'm glad I found something. And then TV, as you know, I like to look at sort of what was coming to an end. See if I remember anything. Oh no, Count Duckula. That was a favourite. That was coming to an end. Damn, it never came back either, according to that. It's probably must be well overdue for a rerun. I wonder if they've. I'll have to look on YouTube, see if someone's uploaded those. I remember this, but didn't. Oh yes, yeah. No, I do remember that now. I thought it was. I think Spider was a character in something else I used to watch. Jeeves and Wooster, yeah, remember that. Was that the one with? Who was in that? Yeah, Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry were in that. Absolutely. Yeah, I used to watch that. Did that have... Oh. Or did I? Yeah, there's been a couple of those that are very similar. I'm trying to think of the one with the character Rabsy Nesbitt in it. That's what it reminds me of. That might be right, something different. Yeah, and this was a favourite of my parents, The Darling Buds of May. I never really got into that. That's Henry's cat. That's cool. So I think 93 as well in the UK. It's funny because when I was working at Radio Rentals, we used to be like an agent for Sky. So I was aware of Sky, and several people that I worked with there had taken advantage of employee rates, I think, like discount. But it's not something I took up. But yeah, that would have been the big thing, you know, if, in the TV, if you wanted to watch anything on the TV in the UK, if you wanted to watch anything outside the regular channels, then really you needed satellite. I don't know if cable had kicked off by 93, and there was certainly digital wasn't around. So yeah. Okay, I think I'm going to call it a halt there. So, hopefully you enjoyed this episode. I certainly have a big smile on my face now as I remember my massive reboot from 93 and then all the musical soundtrack that accompany that. So thanks once again for watching. Bye for now, and I will catch you in a future episode.